Introducing the ZCam E2. It's the camera I didn't need that was the best solution to the camera that I did need. There's already a lot of video out there in the world on the basic features and image quality of the E2, so I'm not going to get into any of that. But I'm going to provide some general impressions as well as look at some of the questions I couldn't find answers to before I bought the E2 and how it might change your workflow, and explore some of the quirks that you should keep in mind before you buy it. And I'm going to look at how it compares to a DSLR and a mirrorless camera, since that's the world that I come from. And given the price point, I imagine that will be true for a lot of people. In the written blog post for this video, there's a link below, and you'll find more information on the specs, the dynamic range charts, bitrate info, and things like that, with a lot of other resources. So let me get started by saying that the camera I needed was actually something that would make shooting conferences easier. I typically shoot a conference with 3 cameras, plus an external audio recorder, and all of my cameras have 29-minute recording limits, making it a mess to stitch together in post, and really a bit of a muddle to shoot too. I was constantly stopping one camera, giving it a moment to cool down and recalibrate, and then 5 minutes later stopping another camera, creating these gaps in the coverage that then needed to be synced later with my audio. I don't do conferences very often, but you really can't afford to mess up even one. So I needed something without a recording limit that was also good in low light. And if it could use my current glass, that would be a plus. I'm a Nikon user. With those 3 criteria, I was already looking at $1,500 or more. And I believe you shouldn't buy anything until you absolutely need it, and then you should buy the very best that you can afford. So the ZCam E2 ticked all of the boxes of things I needed and offered an upgrade in terms of image quality and specs over my Sony a7 III. And you could use a lot of the accessories I already owned. If you read the user reviews for the E2, people are almost unanimously happy with the build, functionality, and image quality. There's always someone who prefers the features or the look of another camera, but that's really just people. And truthfully, there are some concerns with ZRAW, their proprietary RAW format, that I'll get into, as well as some limitations with the image quality at 240 frames per second that I'll probably save for another video. But if you want my overall assessment, I have to agree with the other users. This is one capable little cam. Without getting into the specifics, I'll say that it's both impressive and comforting that you can produce video files that are lower and higher in quality than what I could get on my Sony a7 III. There's a huge amount of flexibility in file types. So you've got ProRes 422 with 10 bits, and you have ZRAW 444 with 12 bit. And you can even drop down to 10 megabytes per second and H.624 if you really want to save space on your card. Currently, the camera can shoot 240 frames a second in full HD, 10-bit H.265 format. And unlike most cameras, it records audio at every frame rate. As for the image quality, out of the box, the 709 colors are really beautiful. They're similar to a Nikon DSLR, which is slightly muted in comparison to the Canon, but still true to the original hues and very easy to tweak in post. Green is the exception here, and the green pops to a level just shy of oversaturated. Z-Log is easier to grade than, say, S-Log. Z-Log is clearly working in the same color space, and that means you're stressing your image less to get it to look normal, which also means that you have more leeway to grade after color correction. If you come from a photographer's world, you understand that color grading is essentially pixel torture. You can only do so much of it before the image gets brittle and starts to fall apart. So having to do less to color correct really helps. I won't describe the physical features in the buttons, there's plenty of info on that, but I'll say that the brick brain format here is something that you really have to be ready to embrace. It's a much different workflow than a mirrorless system or an N camera like the FS5. And this affects your workflow. Unless you've got a weird shaped bag to pack it in, for example, you'll probably take a couple of minutes to set it up when you pull it out. 2 minutes isn't a lot, but that's a big difference from a mirrorless camera that is up and running in 5 seconds. The camera is more challenging to hold while you're making adjustments, and I expect that this awkwardness overall will translate into more scratches on the body of the camera. This, though, is true of every brick brain camera, and no one really complains about the form factor of a red camera. People say it, but it bears repeating that the E2 is a dense little brick. It's surprisingly heavy, and this can affect your gimbal use. It's not as wide as a DSLR or mirrorless camera, and that makes the balancing the tilt angle a little bit more of a challenge. On the Zhiyun Crane version 2, I added a counterweight that makes it possible to balance. I put a little Velcro on the bottom to make it easy to take on and off. But the weight also adds to what the gimbal can support. So if your gimbal can't take a heavy load, you might have problems. I was surprised to find that the Crane V2 could handle this much weight. And while I wouldn't push any angles that are too challenging for the motors, so far I've been able to do my usual moves with the E2 and just a small lens on it. The body of the E2 itself is marvelously small, and there's a plethora of ports on the back that are impressive. Though please, Zcam, make port covers for this thing. You couldn't possibly take it out into the desert like this. There are 4 programmable buttons on the E2, and that's really enough. You can quickly access the settings you change most frequently. The menu organization is well laid out. In fact, with all the additional options on the E2, it may even qualify as a little simpler to navigate than other cameras. Though all of those options can mean you can't turn on one function until you adjust another related parameter, and that takes a while to figure it all out. One of the great things about the E2 is how well it can work with your existing gear. Being a modular camera, you'll need a monitor, but an Android or Apple phone does just fine. You can connect via Wi-Fi or via USB-C if you have an iPhone or some Android phones, though apparently not all. I couldn't get mine to connect via the USB-C. You can control most of the camera functions, though, through the app, which is great. The batteries are super cheap Sony NPs, and there's a good chance you already own some. I had about 10 of these lying around. Coming from the mirrorless world and SD cards, I discovered that CFast cards are really darn expensive. I found these 128 gigabyte cards for $100, and they work just fine. I also discovered that the SSDs that I use for my Atomos recorder work well as an external drive with a $15 case. So between these two memory options, my needs are set for both wireless handheld work and longer tripod setups that would use an SSD. I may buy an external hard drive with automatic backup so that I can transfer my CFast cards on the road. That way I can keep cleaning out one card rather than having multiple more expensive cards to work with. Now, with all of the 1/4-inch holes on the camera itself, you don't really need a cage, but you're going to want one. So let's do a mini review of the small rig cage. I love that it hugs the E2 so closely that it barely increases the size. There are 2 NATO rails built into either side, which is convenient and help keep the rig small. These, though, have a couple of quirks. It's almost impossible, say, to open the CFast slot without a key or a sharp object. And tightening the NATO rail attachment is a fiddly process because there's not enough room between the camera and the cage itself. Why they created a cage that only has 2 out of 3 side holes in alignment beats the hell out of me, but these shortcomings are really worth the reduced size. The other accessory that you don't need but you'll want is a speed booster. I originally bought a Viltrox for my Nikon lenses. At $85, it was a 1/4 of the cost of a Metabones, and I'd heard good things about them. After I bought it, I did read a couple of reviews that said the Viltrox isn't quite as sharp. When mine arrived, I found that it wasn't snug. It was loose where it attached to the camera. That didn't affect picture quality, but if you're pulling focus, it would result in jerkiness. So I found a used Metabone adapter from my Nikon on eBay for $150. I've got a separate blog review that compares the Viltrox and the Metabones, and you can find the link in the description below. Having shot full frame exclusively for the last few years, the one thing I didn't realize is that speed boosters don't allow your Micro Four Thirds sensor to capture a full frame image from your lens. It captures a Super 35 sized image. While I've heard numerous explanations as to why an MFT sensor with a speed booster is just as good as a full-size sensor, it's really not true. My favorite focal length is 28mm. It just looks right to me. With a speed booster, I need to use a 20mm lens to get the same angle of view, and these wider lenses often don't have the same speed, compact form, image quality, and lack of barrel distortion. A fast, wide lens is often more expensive, too. I also find that wider lenses tend to have less character. A lens is like a painter's brush, and each one should be different, not just wider or narrower, but different qualities. These characteristics, however, usually don't start to appear until lenses are about 50mm or more. And a 50 with a speed booster is a 70mm in terms of angle of view, and you're already getting close to the narrowest lens that you'd want to use. With a booster, you probably won't use any lens that's natively above 100mm, and that limits your lens choices. Moreover, while the term speed booster sends the message that your f1.8 lens is actually performing like an f1, in my experience, it doesn't. In fact, when I compare the settings from my Zcam with my Sony a7 III, they often result in darker images. Whatever the reason, when I expose using a light meter, the images are darker on the E2. I'll need to explore this further. With the E2, there are some important differences from a workflow standpoint when compared to a mirrorless camera or a DSLR. While this modular camera can be set up quickly, it's not a run and gun unit. The buttons are slow to access, making things like changing your ISO a lengthier process. Having to re-grip and then click the ISO button and then click up or down to adjust your ISO or shutter or aperture works fine when you're on a set and you have some time. But if you're a one-man band with a client waiting, or you're on the street, or you're in harsh weather, it helps if you can make these adjustments more quickly. And this starts with the very act of pulling it out of your bag to start shooting. It probably won't be fully assembled and ready to shoot, and that means any time that you have to assemble your camera in public, you're probably attracting attention. This is doubly true with an unusual camera like the E2. So there's nothing stealth about the Z-Cam. If you want to speed up your ability to adjust your exposure parameters, the only option I've found is this beautiful but really expensive Riveler Labs handle. I got it because I realized I needed the fluidity of a DSLR camera, and I'm going to do a separate review on this, currently in the works. The tiny screen is surprisingly clear, even with someone with my mediocre eyesight. People say that you can't use it for focusing, and that's mostly true. You wouldn't want to, but in a pinch, it can work. On my first trip out with this camera, I forgot to charge my phone that I was using as a monitor, and it died after about 20 minutes. So I switched the Z-Cam screen to black and white and turned on focus peaking, because a black and white image with red peaking makes it easy to check and focus quickly. With a small screen, I couldn't evaluate the aesthetics of the image, but I could see the framing, the basic exposure, and what's in focus. I've left it in the setup ever since. Even when I'm using a monitor, I really find it's the best use of a tiny screen like this. So far, I'm really pleased with how the Wi-Fi system works. In good conditions, there's really very little latency. You can't connect multiple phones via Wi-Fi, which is a bit of a bummer, but you can use both Wi-Fi and HDMI out so that a client can watch on their own screen. As everyone says, the battery here is pretty awesome. With the different battery sizes, you also adjust the different sizes of your camera. The smallest works well to power the unit, and the little ones give off about an hour of shooting time, with the largest giving off about 4 hours. It's also nice to never have to have it go to sleep. With batteries that last 4 hours, you can set your sleep mode to 15 minutes and really not worry about anything. Now, I mentioned ZRAW before. ZRAW is Z-Cam's proprietary RAW format. It's 12-bit 444, which in theory is great. But Z-Cam says it's tweaked for maximum detail rather than dynamic range, so it's really not great for wide dynamic range scenes with a lot of shadow that need to be pulled up later. You're going to end up with noise. As a new file format, none of the software editors can work with the footage. You have to convert it using Z-Cam software. This isn't surprising, and I'm sure it will be possible to edit directly in your software very soon. Blackmagic, for example, went through the same process with BRAW. But in general, the lack of support on the very specific use for ZRAW makes it feel like it isn't quite ready for general consumption. It's more of a niche use when you've got a well-balanced scene that you want to get the best quality for, and you've got some time in post to do your editing. I get the sense that Z-Cam is positioning this camera uniquely in the market. The hardware and the software are excellent, but in my opinion, there's not enough documentation on the camera as yet. It's a complicated camera, and the manual just covers the basics. So you end up using their Facebook page to find answers, which is kind of awkward. There's a forum for Z-Cam that's operated by somebody else, and I hope that Z-Cam embraces it more, because Facebook is great for showing off your stuff, but it's pretty poor for asking and answering questions. Z-Cam has been aggressively improving their cameras, including updating features via firmware for their existing line, like the E2. For me, I think the E2 is one of those cameras that prove that this is an exciting time to be a filmmaker. For $2,000 plus another $500 or so for accessories, you get a cinema camera that's better than any Hollywood camera that was used up until just a few years ago. In 2006, I worked on a project with a $30,000 RED camera, and this one beats it. Z-Cam is also an exciting company to watch, and I think their upcoming 6K, 8K, and full-frame cameras will shake up the landscape as much as any camera has so far. A great camera doesn't make you a great filmmaker, obviously, and the E2 isn't going to magically fix any problems for you, either artistically or financially, but having this much power and flexibility makes it possible for you to go out and fix those problems for yourself. For me, I'm excited to explore all the possibilities of what I can do with this camera.